I'm with Kelvin Krombie here in Jerusalem, who's a historian. Now, Kelvin, when did Jerusalem become modernized?
Well, I suppose the beginning of the modernization, we have to go back to the time of Napoleon's invasion of this region in 1798. The reason Napoleon and the French came to Egypt ostensibly and later into the land of Israel the following year was because he wanted a strategic stepping stone to cut the British off from India. So he believed if he could capture Egypt and the area where the Suez Canal was later to be developed, he would then be able to sail down to India, defeat the British, and then be master of the East. And what was Britain without India in that period of time? It would be a land without an empire. So that was his strategic goal. The British, however, weren't too happy for that to happen. So they sent down Admiral Nelson to Egypt to defeat Napoleon in 1798, and then later in this country, the land of Israel, 1799. And so by 1800, the British basically were instrumental in kicking the French out of this region by 1801. Now what that did is it triggered off reactions within three communities. First of all, amongst the British government, because they could see how easily a rival European power could come into this region and cut her off from India. So Britain's foreign policy from that time onwards was to keep rival European powers or any potential rival European powers away from this area. Particularly the French from this area, but also to keep the Russians away from control of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, which would connect them through the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. So that was Britain's official foreign policy thereafter, right up until the beginning of the First World War, to support wherever possible the Turks in making sure that no rival European power would ever be able to come into this region and destabilize the Turkish Empire. The second community that Napoleon's invasion affected was the evangelical Christian community in Britain. Now, for 200 years up until that stage, you did have many, many Christians, beginning with the Puritans and then later into the evangelicals, the time of Wesley, Whitefield, etc., and the revival through that period of time. You had many British Christians who were reading the scriptures and seeing that there would be a physical, literal return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Very interesting if you go back and look at some of the writings of the Puritans and other evangelicals during the 1700s. You can see that being written by numerous people, not just by one or two from the fringe, but actually a lot of people from within the center of evangelical Christianity. And when the French Revolution happened in 1789, many British Christians looked upon the revolution as a great sign that they were entering into the last days, because it just destroyed the status quo in Europe. So many Christians, it was like the bombing of the trade centers in New York several years ago. People saw that as a great event, and a lot of people were going back to church. They wanted answers. What's the Bible say about this? There was a lot of trauma within society. Well, that's what the French Revolution did to Britain, because many British people were paranoid that what happened in France and Europe could actually jump over the channel and affect Britain. So you had a lot of people going to church who never used to go to church before. A lot of people returning to the scriptures. A lot of those who went back to the scriptures looked at Matthew 24 and other scriptures which related to the last days, because when such a big event happens, it shakes people up. What's going on in the world? Now in Matthew 24, for instance, Jesus is talking about the things that will happen prior to his return. And there it says that the gospel, well, first of all, it says there should be wars and rumors of wars. So we know that after the French Revolution, there were the Napoleonic Wars, there was all sorts of conflicts, right? But Jesus also said the gospel has to go out to all nations. Now, already in Britain at that time, you had many people who were desirous to take the gospel out, following on from the revival of Wesley and Whitefield, for instance, which really affected Britain, and then, of course, Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield over in America. But no, there was many more people in the world that needed to hear the gospel. So there was already a desire to take the gospel out. But in the 15-year period after the French Revolution began, you had the establishment of all of the major evangelical missionary societies in Britain. For instance, the Baptist Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, and the Bible Society, let alone other smaller societies. They were all birthed in that 15-year period. So here we got Britain fighting, in a sense, wars, some for survival, to keep the French away from here, there, everywhere. And at the same time, those crazy Christians are going around establishing missionary societies to take the gospel out to all nations. So something was happening within British society in that period of time. Now, shortly afterwards, in 1798, Napoleon invades this region. So once news gets back to Britain, and it's in the newspapers, or people begin to hear about it, then they're beginning to put two and two together. They're already in that period of expectancy. What's going to happen in the world? When's Jesus going to come back? A lot of people by this stage were also saying, well, in the context of the last days, if in fact we're in the last days, they would say, well, God's also promised in the scriptures that the Jewish people will physically go back to the land of Israel. And bango, next thing you know, the French are here in this region. First of all, Egypt, then in the land of Israel. And the British come in both places to kick them out. So all of a sudden the newspapers have got reports of what was happening in this region. So people are reading the Bibles, the scriptures, the prophecies, etc., etc. And after their quiet time in the morning, they sit down with a newspaper and they're seeing the very same places written in the newspapers. So quite a few people thought, looks like God's going to use the French to be the restorers of Israel. And some other more British ones would say, hang on, how can he use the French? Okay? So ultimately, when through the British Navy, the French were finally kicked out of this region, many then began to say, well, if God's going to use any nation to be the modern-day Cyrus who would bring the Jewish people back, he's going to use Britain. Several reasons. First of all, because Britain ruled the waves. Okay, so she was in the best position from a maritime perspective to bring the Jewish people back. But secondly, because many people said, well, Britain is a Protestant country, whereas France and others were not. And so they had this belief that, if God's going to use any nation to bring the Jewish people back, he will use Britain. Now, I'm not saying that was across the board, but it was strong enough at the beginning of the 1800s to influence movements thereafter. In the same period of time, the London Missionary Society was established, of course, in Britain, and was already sending missionaries out to different parts of the world. And they also had an interest in the Jewish people. So when, in 1801, a Jewish believer in Jesus called Joseph Frey came from Berlin to London, then ostensibly to go to South Africa to work with the LMS, when he came and began to work, or wanted to work amongst the Jewish people in London, the LMS said, yes, let's go for it. And so Joseph Frey began to work with the London Missionary Society. There were others that supported him. And in time, it became very, very clear that it was almost impossible to combine a ministry to the Gentiles and a ministry to the Jewish people under the same umbrella, because you need to have different methodologies, different materials. And so ultimately, Frey and some others broke away from the London Missionary Society, and in 1809 established what today is called CMJ, but then was called the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, which was the first missionary society established in that time to bring the message of Jesus to the Jewish people. So that was 1809, and thereafter the organization began to grow and to develop. After the Napoleonic Wars were over, then that organization began to move out into Europe, and by the 1820s the vision was to bring the message of Jesus to the Jewish people here in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem in particular. But to do that was a tall order. For instance, if you look at the regulations of the Turks at the time, they did not permit foreigners to live in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. You had to be a member of a recognized community, which Protestants were not. They were not a recognized community. Secondly, Protestants could not own land, could not own property, because they were not a recognized community. And thirdly, no new churches at all could be built. Old churches could be restored, but no new churches could be built. So if you were an evangelical missionary society wanting to establish a presence here, then you had everything against you. So at that time, the pioneer workers that came here, they saw these obstacles. They wrote back to the organization in London and they said, listen, it's an impossible task unless two things happen. Firstly, there's a change of government. And they're saying that the Turks have to be out of power here. Now, that's a tall order to ask, but people began to pray thereafter. Now, I've seen copies of the letters that have gone out and been published in the periodicals of CMJ at the time. The other thing they said that needs to happen is there needs to be a British consulate here, because without the presence of a British consul, there will be no protection, especially if you were from a community which actually had no legal status here. Now, in the next 15 years, within 15 years after those 2 points being sent from here to London and produced, within 15 years, both of those points were actually answered. Both those things actually came to pass. There was a change of government, and Britain did establish a consulate in Jerusalem. Now, in my opinion, At least it was a miracle. But on both accounts, it was a miracle, and I believe it's the finger of God, in a sense, coming down and interfering or being involved in the affairs of man. Now, they came about through geopolitical terms. I have no problem with that because I believe that God is sovereign anyway over whatever happens in the nations around the world. So what happened in that period of time, in brief, is that there's a dynamic. It's called the battle between the empires. Through centuries, millennium actually, there's been a conflict between the Empire of the North and the Empire of the South. And in the 1820s and 30s, the Empire of the North was Turkey, and it had control of the whole region. And ultimately, the Empire of the South, Egypt, rose up in revolt and invaded this country and kicked the Turks out. And when they did that, the Egyptians realized they had to make sure they did not upset the European powers, and especially Britain. And so they invited any British subjects who wanted to live in the land of Israel to do so in the 1830s. And of course, there was no great line outside the Egyptian consulate in London, people wanting visas to come here. Yeah, there was only one or two, and that was the missionaries that belonged to CMJ. So, and also some Americans, I have to say as well, from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. But because the Americans then did not have the status that the British had, it was the British who made the first move. So in October 1833, John Nicolason came to live here as the first Protestant Christian to be able to live in Jerusalem. In that same period of time, the 1830s, the organisation was quite well known in British government circles. There were quite a few members of the British government who were involved in the organisation. And there was a man called Lord Shaftesbury, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who was heavily involved in CMJ. He later became the president. He was involved for 51 years, actually. And he was instrumental in a sense, pushing forward any of the agendas of CMJ, which was to get property and to build a church. Now, both of those things were tall orders. Even though there was now a Protestant living here, the chances of ever being able to get property and building a church were very, very remote. It just so happens that Nicolason in time did get land, and we're actually at that very piece of real estate now. So this is the first piece of Protestant real estate in the entire land of Israel, in Jerusalem. And he purchased this in 1838 through an Armenian who was a friend, and they could actually get the property through that way. And later it was actually confirmed, the sale was confirmed, and the title deed was placed with the British consulate. Now, how did we get a British consulate in Jerusalem? Well, the organisation had first made the request in 1823, but that's just to have a consul here to protect a few Protestant missionaries wasn't going to push the British government. By the 1830s, Lord Palmerston was the Foreign Secretary, and he was related by marriage to Lord Shaftesbury, who was the key figure in this organisation, CMJ. And Palmerston also had geopolitical factors in mind for having a consul here, because he knew that if a British consul was based here in Jerusalem, he could keep an eye on the activities of the other European powers, in particular the French and the Russians. Why? Because the French were the official protectors of all Roman Catholics in the Middle East, and the Russians were the official protectors of all Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. So, if either of those two religious bodies began to expand and develop and grow and build and whatever else, more than likely it's their sponsor nations who are somehow behind it, that is France and Russia. And so Palmerston said, right, if we have a British consulate here, he can take care of those few Protestant missionaries who are residing in Jerusalem, and on the other hand, he can also keep an eye on what's going on. So from that point onwards, from 1838, when the decision was made, 1839, when the consul came to live in Jerusalem, this, in my opinion, is the beginning point of the modernization, political modernization of Jerusalem. 1833, when Nicolason came to live here, was in a sense the real beginning point, but from a political perspective, 1838, when the British consulate was established in Jerusalem.
I'm speaking to Kelvin Krombie about the history of Jerusalem. Last week I asked him when Jerusalem became modernized, and he told me about the British consulate being established in Jerusalem. Let's continue with our conversation.
1833, when Nicolason came to live here, was in a sense the real beginning point, but from a political perspective, 1838, when the British consulate was established in Jerusalem. Because thereafter, a political statement had now been made. The greatest empire in the world was sending a consul to live in Jerusalem. No reason for a consul to live here. The ambassador was in Constantinople, and consuls were only sent to places of economic importance. At that time, Jerusalem had no economic importance whatsoever. Okay, so now the greatest empire in the world sends a consul here. It makes a statement. Thereafter, every other European power wanted to do the same. Now, added to this was that the consul, when he came, actually had some very interesting instructions, not only to protect British residents, but also to protect the Jewish people who were here. Now, there were only a handful of Jewish people who lived here, who had British citizenship. The majority did not. So Britain was actually making a very, very bold statement. We are there to protect Jewish people. Now, at that time, the Jewish people were at the bottom of the ladder. Every other community was above them. The Protestants weren't officially on the ladder anyway, but the Jewish people were at the bottom of the ladder. Anybody could just kick them around and do what they wanted. Now, the greatest empire in the world was saying, we are going to protect the Jewish people in Jerusalem and elsewhere. That is a huge, a mega big step, especially for the Jewish people. And they knew, aha, if there's any problems in the future, we can go to the British consul who can do something on our behalf. So the status quo of Jerusalem was now being turned upside down. In the same period of time, there were political tensions again. The French did come in, begin to support Egypt, and the Russians came in and began to support Turkey. Palmerston wanted to come in, but the British government sort of kept him at an arm's length, and they didn't want Britain to get involved. So by 1839, 1840, there was the potential of another clash between Egypt and Turkey. Now, if either of those entities really won a war, then it would really be the French and the Russians who cashed in, and Britain would be left out in the cold. And so Palmerston orchestrated an alliance with Turkey, and he brought in with Russia, who was already allied to Turkey, and Palmerston, the British, brought in Austria and Prussia to make it a bigger alliance, so they perhaps wouldn't go down to be with the Egyptians and the French. And then in 1840, an ultimatum was given to the Egyptians that they had to leave this area because they were actually threatening the stability of Turkey itself. And the Egyptians refused, and so in 1840 there was a small conflict in which primarily the British Navy came in and defeated the Egyptians that were here. So if there's going to be a conflict in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, you can guarantee that every Tom, Dick and Harry is going to be interested in the outcome. And sure enough, everyone was interested in the outcome. And the members of the Quadruple Alliance, the nations who were now going to support Turkey, then had their own agendas for the future of the Holy Land, and they presented their own proposals for the future. The French had their, well, the French were on the other side, of course, so they came in a bit later, but the Austrians had their idea, the Russians had their idea, the Prussians, bless them, had their own idea, and the British had their own idea. Now, the British proposal was very, very unique, because they weren't proposing anything for themselves. They were actually proposing that the Turks, their allies, permit the Jewish people to come back in great numbers and to be restored to the land of Israel. And Palmerston was supportive of this. He got Shaftesbury, he got CMJ, he got a Jewish believer in Jesus named Scott Calman, the Church of Scotland. They all sent in letters and memorandums, and then Palmerston said, right, there's a consensus of opinion in Britain that now it's time for the Jewish people to go back to the land of Israel. So he then sent this memorandum onto his ambassador to transfer to the Sultan and the government of Turkey to say, now's the time for the Jewish people to come back. The Turks, of course, weren't going to play with that, and they vetoed it. But it shows that in 1840, already the British government, through the influence of the evangelical Christians, had the vision for a restored Israel. The problem there, of course, was, one, the British government was allied to Turkey, and Turkey, as a Muslim country, was not going to condone this. Two, the Jewish people themselves were not ready. Even though there had been a growing interest ever since Napoleon's invasion, because that was the third group of people that was interested after Napoleon's invasion, yet there was still such a small number, because the bulk of the Jewish people believed that first of all the Messiah would have to come, and he would bring the Jewish people back, he would redeem them. And they had no real strong movement, what we call later the Zionist movement. There was no strong Zionist movement in that period of time. It was primarily the evangelical Christians of Britain and other countries, but primarily Britain, who had this vision. So the plan didn't succeed. So by 1841, the Turks were back in control. There was going to be a peace agreement for the pacification of the Levant, which would be signed in London in July of 1841. Now, in that juncture, the King of Prussia said, this is my opportune time. He'd just come to power, King Frederick William IV, and he had a vision, what he called his Midnight Summer's Dream, in which he envisaged a worldwide Protestant church with Jerusalem as the centre and the starting point. In all honesty, he had some geopolitical motives behind his proposed plan, and he also realised that he couldn't do anything on his own. He was such a small entity, vis-a-vis the French, the British, the Russians, that he needed to be allied to somebody else, and that somebody else was Britain. And so he made a proposal in June 1841 that the British establish an Anglican bishopric here, would send an Anglican bishop to Jerusalem, and the covering would be for German Christians as well as British Christians and anybody else who wanted to have representation in Jerusalem. Because then the Middle East only knew patriarchs and bishops and people of that particular nature. And so the British said, yes, this is a great idea. And so in 1841, the Jerusalem Bishopric Act was passed through both Houses of Parliament, got the Queen's assent in record time. And this would be an Anglican bishopric, but really it was a Protestant bishopric. Okay, and the British would nominate the first bishop, the Prussians the second, the British the third, the Prussians the fourth, etc. And even the Prussian nominee, they'd have to be bilingual. But even if the Prussian nominee was German, he would still have to be ordained as a member of the Anglican Church. But he would represent the German Protestants. But at the same time, of course, for Prussia, there would be some sort of a political alliance with Britain in this, you see, so it was good for the Prussians geopolitically. And the first bishop to be chosen was a former rabbi called Michael Solomon Alexander. So he came here in 1842 not only as the first Protestant bishop, but the first bishop of Jewish descent for 1,707 years, bearing in mind that all the first bishops of the church, the Messianic movement in Jerusalem, were Jewish. So Alexander was in a sense, representing the third British stroke Protestant institution. The first was CMJ, then there was the British consulate, and there was the Protestant bishopric. Now, if you look at those three institutions, you'll see that they were pioneers in their own fields. I'll give you an example. After Britain established the consulate, in the space of 15 years, every European government plus America established consulates in Jerusalem, and a number of them also gave protection to Jewish people from their own countries who were living here. So the status of Jewish people began to improve thereafter, which didn't please the Muslims too much, as you could imagine. With CMJ, for instance, they in time established the first medical work here, the first educational work here, and other institutions as well, including welfare. And as a result of that, the other communities, especially the Jewish community, had to establish their own welfare and educational and health facilities in order to counteract the role of the Protestant mission. Thirdly, under the bishopric, other German institutions and other British institutions in time began to come into the country, because there was some sort of a covering here, including CMS, okay, and also an institution called the Deaconesses Institute from Germany, which sent in German nurses to work amongst the Arab community. So from, let's say, the mid-1840s into the 1850s, under the second bishop, who was a German nominee called Bishop Samuel Gobate, you find there were other Protestant institutions who began to come into work amongst the Arab community. Now, when these Protestant institutions then began to develop their welfare and educational work, etc., which was CMJ's aim was to bring those institutions to the Jewish community. Those other CMS and German organizations would be looking more to the Arab community. Then, of course, that triggered off a reaction from within the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church in particular, who began then to upgrade their own status. Even the Orthodox and the Catholic churches upgraded their overall status by bringing patriarchs back to live in Jerusalem. They'd been living comfortably elsewhere in Constantinople. So suddenly, the Orthodox and the Catholic churches both brought their patriarchs to live in Jerusalem. And the Latin Patriarchate was built, for instance, in the late 1840s. And so you can see that as a result of those three institutions, CMJ, the bishopric and the consulate, the whole face of Jerusalem began to change. So by 1850, the foundations had well and truly been laid in the city for the subsequent development of the city and of the land, because in time those organisations began to spread out all over the entire country. So if you want to, for instance, understand the development of this city and of this country, even from the Israeli perspective going back and then into the Mandate period, if you really want to understand the beginning point of modernisation, you have to go back to those three Protestant institutions, why they were established, and the results of their establishment. And in my opinion, this really is the beginning point, and that's the opinion of many Israeli scholars as well, and that's why we have, on a monthly basis, we have hundreds of Israelis come to visit. We have 3 heritage centres, one at Christchurch, one at the Anglican school, and one at Bet Emmanuel in Jaffa, which are all properties which our organisation owns. We have established heritage centres to give out this information. Lots of Israeli groups will come, receive our lectures, look at the materials that are there. And the real foundations of it, in my opinion, was this strong belief system within Victorian evangelical England in the first decades of the 19th century, which believed that they were coming into the last days. A lot of people didn't have dates then. There's a few who set dates, but generally speaking, they weren't really talking about dates. They just had a general feeling. They didn't have maps and schemes and all that sort of stuff, which later became vogue. They didn't have that so much. It was just, the Bible says the Jewish people will go back and Jesus will return, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem. We want to see it happen, but we first of all believe the Jewish people have to come back. So it was more of a general view, and people just got into it and said, well, let's go out. Let's not just sit back in the UK and twiddle our thumbs and believe it and pray for it. Let's go out and do something. So these were people that went out, and they only went out because there was a widespread belief system in Britain in that period of time. And in my opinion, that's how it all began.
In the next 2 episodes, we will look at the establishment of the Protestant Church and bishops in Jerusalem and the building of Christ Church.
Okay, so first of all, Paul will recapitulate. We'll go a bit over some of the stuff that we presented last time. It was such a long time ago. We're looking at the beginning of British and Protestant interest in this land and city in this region. And they started off with, you might say, 3 institutions, which was CMJ, Church's Ministry Among Jewish People, and then the British Consulate, and then the Protestant Bishopric. But even though there was 3 separate institutions, there's a large amount of interrelation between all 3. Of that there's no doubt about at all. Behind all that, there are 2 factors which I'd like to go over again, in a sense, to set the foundation or the platform. One was geopolitics, which is basically the interests of the government in this region, the British government. Why was the British government interested in this region? And that's because they were concerned that a rival European power would take control over this area and potentially cut her off from her Eastern Empire, which was primarily India. Although Australia and New Zealand and Sri Lanka and those other countries were there, primarily at that stage it was India. And so that, in a sense, was the background for all of Britain's decisions in this entire period of time, from the time the consulate was established right up until 1915, the First World War. That was her prime consideration. 1914, things began to change a bit, but basically that was the premise all the way through. Of course, when the Suez Canal was then built in 1869, that made this region even more important for Britain, because then there was a tangible connection between Europe and the Far East, and Britain had to be sure that no rival European power would be close enough to actually take over that strategic area. And that's why, for instance, the British government under Disraeli was able to purchase many of the shares, the controlling interest, in 1875. So that's one factor. The other factor behind all this whole story is the interest of the British Evangelical Church at that time, going from the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Okay, around the 1850s it probably peaked in many ways of this interest in Israel's restoration. Thereafter it became more standardized, but until then it was all quite new. The prophecies were there, people would read the prophecies and they would say, yes, there is definitely a case for the Jewish people going back into the land of Israel in unbelief, and we want to see that happen. And so I suppose by the 1850s or so, they began to see more and more that somehow or other this was actually connected to Britain itself. Until that point, people were sort of saying, yes, it could happen, one European power or another, etc. But by the 1860s, you can possibly see a bit of a coming together. So from that point on, you might almost say the geopolitical and those spiritual interests were merging more and more consistently. Now, behind that, in my opinion, is the hand of a sovereign God. Now, I believe that the Lord is able to put together all sorts of things that man is never able to put together, because we're talking about different institutions here, we're talking about different personalities and different movements. Now, how did they all finally just come together? When you look at the period of 1914 through to 1917, the First World War, etc., a lot of those things just came together. Well, I believe there has to be a master planner behind all that. But instead of getting all sort of super spiritual about the whole thing, what we need to do is just look at the plain facts. Just look at the facts on the ground, and I think they speak the story. So let's go back to the story then, basically from the early 1840s with the coming in of Bishop Alexander, 1842. Now, all the things that John Nicolaisen had done in the previous decade for laying a foundation were built upon by Bishop Alexander. He was the figurehead. He was a bishop. So therefore he had a lot of clout, a lot more clout than Nicolaisen would have had. He was a reverend and he was a great guy, but having a bishop in that position was very, very important. Because in the eyes of the people in this region, you had to be a member of an established church, you had to have a bishop, you had to have property, you had to have a church. That was status. Okay, that's how people saw things in this region. So having a Protestant entity here, which wasn't even heard of a decade or so before, suddenly having the presence of a bishop, and a Jewish bishop at that. And it was all, in a sense, associated with the establishment just a few years before of the British consulate. This placed the whole Protestant and British influence on a higher rung of the ladder, you might say. And that in itself was going to cause problems. It doesn't matter what sort of personality Bishop Alexander had. The very fact that he was here was going to upset the status quo. And sure enough, it did. Because the status quo had been in standing for hundreds of years. And there was the Muslims there, all the other minority groups underneath, the Jewish people at the bottom. Nobody else could come on. All of a sudden, the Protestants are wanting to get on. And don't forget that just earlier, the British consul's instructions were to protect Jews. Now, the Jewish people were at the bottom of the ladder. So now, all of a sudden, the greatest empire in the world comes in and actually is offering protection to Jewish people. Oy, boy, boy, this is, this contravenes the established status quo. Bishop Alexander comes in as a head of a non-recognized Christian community, and he begins to work amongst the Jewish people. And so there are lots and lots of dynamics happening in Jerusalem in that period of time. They began to work in the church a lot more, even though it was contrary to Islamic law to build the church. People were turning a bit of a blind eye. It was just going to be it was supposed to be part of the buildings of this place. But when they began to realize it was actually going to be a church, then that began to cause the temperatures to rise as well. Now, in October of 1842, 3 rabbis who'd been under instruction previously by a guy called Peretz, who himself was a Jewish believer, they finally came to faith. Or, let's say, they were very, very interested in following Jesus. Now, once that became known, these guys are rabbis. Now, in these days, if 3 rabbis in one city of the world came to faith in Jesus, it wouldn't take long before everybody hears about it, right? Now, in those days, Jerusalem was just inside the walls of the old city, and it wasn't a very big community. Okay, now just imagine if you're living in Jerusalem in those days, and suddenly you hear or wake up one morning, and the newspaper says 3 rabbis have just become believers in Jesus. Of course, it's going to really rock the boat, and sure enough, it did. But the interesting fact here was that those 3 rabbis were actually Russian nationals. They weren't locals, they were Russian nationals. So, in a sense, legally, they would have come under the protection of the local Russian consular representative. The Russians didn't have a consul here, they just had a representative, who himself was a rabbi, Rabbi Isaiah Bordaki. And when these 3 rabbis began to be hassled because of their faith in Jesus or their pursuance of Jesus. They caused a local uproar, and they were hounded, and they rushed off to, I think it was Nicolaus's house or one of the houses of some of the other missionaries. And then they began to claim British protection because they were associated with a British institution, which was CMJ, and so therefore they were sort of claiming some protection from the British consul from all this persecution they were getting and going to get. Well, that's a no-no because they were Russian nationals. And so the Russian consul representative said, hang on, you're actually violating the status quo here. If they're under any protection, they have to be under our protection. But of course, he was a rabbi of the Jerusalem community, so you could just imagine what was going to wait for them when they came under his consular protection. So the British consul got involved, and Bishop Alexander got involved, and what in one sense was just a minor incident, although you couldn't call 3 rabbis coming to faith in Jerusalem a minor incident. Nevertheless, soon became an international incident and could have gone actually further. And the British consul and the consul general up in Beirut, they were able to, in a sense, convince Alexander just to back off and let things take their natural course. But, of course, but it gave the Turkish authorities now the excuse they needed to put the Protestants into place, because the Protestants had rudely upset the status quo. Until that point, the Turkish Pasha and the local authorities weren't willing to do too much, but now they had to do something. So they stopped construction of the church in January 1843. And this caused Nicolaus and Alexander quite some consternation, because they had proceeded probably about a metre above ground. It was there. It was clearly there for all to see. So anyhow, the issue then was taken out of the hands of the local constituents here and became a matter for the governments. But now, of course, the German government, the Prussian government, and the Prussian king were involved, because this is where he wanted German Protestant interests to be centred. And the British government took up the issue, but also the Austrians and the Russians and the French all got involved at Constantinople, because they looked upon this venture here as a beefing up of the Protestant interests in the region as opposed to theirs. So you've got to realise in those days, in a sense, you cannot separate pure things of faith from these other bigger dynamics. A Russian rabbi coming to faith in Jesus, that's his own personal conviction, but the ramifications of that were much greater. And so that's what happened. So the issue of the building of a church, you might say, oh, it's only a church, goodness sake, Protestants, there's not many of them here, it's not going to be a big place anyway, we own the land, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal was it's against Islamic law. So the issue went to Constantinople and was debated for a number of years. The British had a good ambassador at the time, Stratford Canning, but the other powers, including the Muslims, who did not want to see their law contravened, and also the other European powers also got involved as well. And the issue became of national importance for Britain. And so it was debated in Parliament, for instance, and then in 1845, the archbishops of Canterbury and York and many of the bishops, I think something like 1,200 clergy and about 12,000 laity, 12,000 people signed a petition. Now, petitions weren't that common in those days. I think that Wilberforce and his Cupham's group had a petition for the abolition of slavery, but there weren't that many petitions in those days. This was one of the few. And that petition was presented to the British government, and the government realised, well, we really have to do something here, because this is a matter of importance for the nation. It was now, in a sense, British pride as well that's involved, because don't forget that Turkey only came back into this country in 1840 after it was primarily a British force which ousted the Egyptians who were here. Okay, so Turkey had been here, Egypt had taken over, Egypt was going to conquer Turkey itself, Britain came in to help Turkey, and they forced the Egyptians out, and therefore Turkey took control again. So in a sense, Turkish rule here was very much dependent upon that British connection. So there were quite a few British people who knew that. A lot of those British Christians, they knew that. So when the British government then sent a letter to the Turkish Sultan with that petition, there was a letter that went with it saying this is a matter of national importance, and with it there were some words to the effect of, And listen, don't forget who helped you get back in control of the country in 1840. A nice subtle little hint there. And the Turkish Sultan was now caught between a rock and a hard place. What's he going to do? He has to uphold Islamic law on one hand. So, I mean, if you break a particular law, you can actually open the floodgates, right? At any place. But this is a high principle of Islamic law, forbade the building of new churches, because it keeps the minority groups in their place. And if Protestants weren't even a group anyway, and now they get permission to build a church, I mean, that's really a double whammy no-no. So anyhow, that's what they had to look at. Are we going to give these Protestants, who aren't even a recognised community, permission to build a church? And the Islamic jurists would say, no way, Jose, you can't do that. That is contrary to our law. Yes, said the Sultan, probably, but I'm dependent upon Britain. Britain helped me get the country back, and, that they are my ally, blah, blah, blah. How do we go about this? Well, the proposal had already been made quite a few years before, actually, of the church being associated or attached to the British consul. And that had happened in other places as well. In certain cities, for instance, where there were economic activities from one particular country, and they might have had a consul there. Well, those Christians associated with the consulate would have a little room set aside where they could worship. That was called the consular chapel, or the embassy chapel. And so that idea was brought forth again, modified a bit, and finally, towards the end of 1845, permission was granted to build not a church, but a private chapel of the British consul in Jerusalem. And that's what they call an official Ferman edict. So that was relayed back here, November of 1845, and in that same period of time, Bishop Alexander was en route to Egypt, and then from there he was going back to Britain. One of his children was in Britain studying, and he was going back on furlough. But he died in November 1845, not far from Cairo, and later his body was brought back, and that's the story. You could almost write a book just on how they got his body back here and all that sort of stuff. Incredible story. But he was brought back here and buried, firstly in the Protestant burial ground, which is over near Mamilla, and then later they had to move his body to Mount Zion, to the Protestant cemetery. So it was all very ironical in a sense that at the very time when the official notification came for the completion of the Protestant church, Bishop Alexander dies and comes back here. Although it has to be said, a lot of the spade work in this was done by Nicolaisen. Now what's interesting is that according to the original wording of that Turkish Ferman, it said that the chapel had to be built within the British consular residence. But yes, you can see the church is not within. So they actually went to the letter of the law and said, well, you have to build it again inside the British consular residence. And by that stage, they'd moved the what they call the Cancellaria, the consular archives, over to this building at the end of this room we're in now. So they were going by the letter of the law, so the whole thing had to go back to Constantinople again, and the Sultan said, okay, let's just let them continue. But the stipulation then was they had to build the consular residence attached to the church. If you look at the original plans, the church was actually separate, it was by itself. But then they had to build the building, which we call Gobate, next to the church, and that was to be the residence of the British consul, and the church was therefore attached and therefore part of the British consular residence. So that's how they, in a sense, managed to get around that. So that's how the Protestant church finally was built. In a nutshell, there's a much bigger story to it, of course. And then several years later, in 1849, 1850, in that period of time, through a whole range of circumstances, the Turkish regime actually officially recognized Protestantism as a millet or community here in the Middle East. Now, there were American missionaries working in the Lebanon area. There were other missionaries working. There was some Irish, for instance, in Damascus. There were other Americans and other British organizations, the Scots, for instance, working then in Constantinople, in Smyrna, etc., etc. So it wasn't just a matter of this church being built here, but the issue of this church being built in Jerusalem was actually a major factor because it was something very tangible. And all those other locations, with the exception of Alexandria, where the British commercial group built a church down there, St. Mark's, in 1845. This was a different issue altogether. This was actually a bona fide church building built in the middle of Jerusalem, not in some small little place where it was in Alexandria, or not a consular residence somewhere in Aleppo or wherever else. This was in the middle of Jerusalem, so it was a big factor. So in my opinion, it's one of the major things which actually happened, which led to the official recognition of Protestantism. Now, once that happened, once Protestantism was officially recognized, then you almost might say the floodgates opened, because it was thereafter easier for Protestant groups, evangelical Christian groups, to come from a whole range of different countries.
This week in our second part program with historian Kelvin Krombie, we look back at the modern history of Jerusalem. Kelvin begins by talking about the bishops of Jerusalem.
Now, the replacement for Alexander was a man called Samuel Gobate, who was actually from the French-speaking area of Switzerland, and Gobate had previously worked with the Church Missionary Society. So he came out here in 1846, end of 1846, to be the second bishop, the nomination of the Prussians. But he had to be an Anglican minister in order to become the bishop, but he was nominated by the Prussians. So he was bilingual, had studied for a while also in England. And he had a vision which was much broader than the original concept. The original concept was that the bishop would be primarily the shepherd for the lost sheep of Israel, with some Gentiles attached. But the fact is that now, under Gobate, that vision was much more broadened, and he saw Jew and Gentile. And because there are many more Gentiles here than Jews, many more Gentiles thereafter became a member or members of the Protestant community. Now, it was very, very difficult, of course, in those days to reach out to the Muslims with the gospel, because it was virtually a death sentence if anybody did become a believer in Jesus, have a personal conviction. And so he then began to work more amongst the local Christian communities, who, because of the way they were set up, the majority of them had never actually heard of the person of Jesus. Many of them had never read the scriptures themselves, so he did all sorts of things. He really emphasized education, for instance, and he established schools all over the country, and including in Transjordan. One of his major schools was here on Mount Zion, what is now the Jerusalem University College. Okay, that was originally the Bishop Gobate School. But he established schools all over the place. So he emphasized education, that people could read, and therefore themselves read the scriptures. But he also had another very interesting thing. He called them Bible readers, or sometimes colporteurs. A colporteur was like a roving missionary who would go out to the villages and hand out scriptures. But if the people couldn't read in the first place, what was the use of giving them scriptures, okay? They have to go to school first. And so what a lot of these people would do would go to a little village and would openly read the scriptures. And that was quite innovative, if you think about it, in a loud voice, just sitting there and reading out portions of the scriptures. Now, of course, many of particularly the Greek Orthodox priests, didn't like this, because it was actually opposing their authority. Just like in the time of Jesus, when Jesus did what he was doing, he was opposing the authority of the local rabbinical authorities. And what CMJ was often doing here and all around the world where she was operating, her message, CMJ's message of Jesus as Messiah, was violating or opposing the authority of the rabbis. So too now was what Gobate was doing, was violating or opposing the authority of the Greek Orthodox priests. And so oftentimes you had real uproars. And for instance, in Nablus, there was a real big uproar in Nablus, and lesser ones elsewhere. But Gobate persevered. What he also did is he invited in the Church Missionary Society, which was the largest of the British evangelical organizations, because it was Anglican, and it was a ministry to the worldwide. He also invited in a group called the Deaconesses from Germany to establish medical work amongst the Arab people. CMJ had already established their institutions in Jerusalem and later in Sfat, which was a medical work to the Jewish people, and they pioneered the medical work in this country, incidentally. But the Arab community were missing out, so that's what Gobate did. He was looking out for the interests of the average Arab person as well. There was also a group that came from Basel in Switzerland called St. Krishona, not directly related to Gobate, but nevertheless he was able to offer them some covering. So you might say that by the 1860s, and also at that period of time, the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society came in and began to work up in Nazareth. So you might say that by the 1860s, foundations had been established all over the country, and even into the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. By that stage, the Scottish mission to the Jewish people also came in, began to work in Tiberias and later Tzfat. So you might say that by the 1890s, every major town, the city in the entire country, had a strong evangelical witness, either to the Jewish people, in the case of CMJ and the Scottish mission, but also to the Arab people and the Gentiles through these other organizations. Now, in the midst of all that, there's another very interesting dynamic, and that is the Germans. When the Germans began initially, it was here, under the covering of the bishopric, and because there was now a Prussian connection there, the Prussians sent out a consul, 1843 he came, and that sort of upped the ante a little bit. The British had sent out the first consul, and because they had done that, all the other European powers then began to send their own consuls in, and later America did as well. Now, as far as the Prussians were concerned, with the presence of this bishopric, of which they are a part of, and the consul, they now had a covering in which to grow their interests. Then more so under Gobate, because he was their nomination, and even though he was from Switzerland and not from Germany and from whatever else, nevertheless he had a heart for German interests as well. So under him, German interests just grew and grew and grew. And oftentimes he clashed with the second British consul, a man called Consul James Finn, who also arrived in 1846 with his wife Elizabeth Ann, who was the daughter of one of CMJ's major workers in Warsaw. Now, the Finns were very interested in the Jewish people, okay, and they did whatever they could on behalf of the Jewish people. They established the first agricultural settlement called Kerem Avraham, Abraham's Vineyard, which is over near Mea Shearim, for Jewish people who were destitute during the Crimean War. They were involved in all sorts of initiatives on behalf of the Jewish people. So oftentimes they clashed with the CMJ leadership, because the CMJ leadership thought that they actually weren't evangelistic enough in their initiatives with the Jewish people, helping them temporarily, but not sharing the gospel message with them. But the Finns also clashed very often with Gobate, because Gobate was the Anglican bishop. They felt he was actually furthering German interests. So you can see how the ambiguity in the Protestant bishopric at the very beginning was sometimes had implications later on, especially in the time of the Prussian bishop. So they were interesting times. A number of the Israeli scholars, for instance, really home in upon this relationship between Finn and Gobate and CMJ in the midst of all that. And as rightfully so, there's some very interesting stories in that period of time. But the German interest continued to grow. So when Gobate died in 1879, prior to that he had actually bequeathed many of his private institutions to the CMS. When he died, it was time for the Brits to nominate the third bishop, and they nominated an Irishman called Joseph Barclay, who'd previously been head of centre here. But Barclay lasted less than 2 years, so in 1881, when he died, it was now time for the Germans to nominate the fourth bishop. By that stage, Prussia had developed and had become Germany, the German Empire of 1871. And whereas in 1841 they were dependent upon Britain like a little sister to a big sister, the tables had now turned. By that period of time, German institutions probably outnumbered British institutions in this country, and they had a lot of energy invested and to invest in this region. Germany itself was looking for expanding, or territorially there wasn't much more she could expand to, because the British and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and even the Russians had taken care of much of the world. So she was also looking for avenues of expanding culturally and economically. And so that's, in a sense, the only way that she could expand in this region, in the former Turkish Empire. So lots of factors involved, and so ultimately she pulled out. 1886, she finally pulled out of the bishopric and went her own way thereafter. And one of the first things that they did in going their own way was to establish their own independent presence. They had already been given property down near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They began to develop that, and that was a complex later known as the Redeemer Church, which was opened by the Kaiser himself in 1898. The German Kaiser came out on a state visit to open the church. And that was all part of this whole scenario of Germany trying to forge a closer relationship with Turkey. And so you can't divorce those two aspects, okay, in the Kaiser's visit of 1898. So when he came here, for instance, it was almost like putting the cream on top of the cake in many ways. But look at where it all began. It all began here at Christchurch, 50-odd years before. And I've spoken over the years to numerous Germans, Christians and German groups, and I've said to them on many occasions, well, where do you think German interests first began here? And they'll say, oh, the Church of the Redeemer, of course. And I say, well, did you know that actually that's not true? The first German Christian involvement was here at Christchurch. The first German services were here at Christchurch. They had their own minister who was sent out in 1853, Valentina, and we've got the German Bible in our museum, and they all had their services here. So they had outgrown here and grown into their own identity. Conversely, when the bishopric finished, 1886, now the Anglican Church had to make a decision. Does it continue on with having this bishopric in Jerusalem? It was a controversial subject in the first place. There were many in England who didn't want this to happen, who didn't want the Anglican Church to join with the Protestant Church of Germany in a dual relationship. And so there were many who now clamoured for having it dissolved. CMJ and CMS, of course, being evangelical Anglicans, didn't want it to be dissolved, wanted it to continue, but of course in the same vein as before, evangelical bishops who desired to see the clear message of Jesus presented to the people of this country, Jew and Gentile. Anyhow, so the Archbishop of the time made somewhat of a compromise solution. He decided to keep the bishopric going, what would somehow change its character. It would be a bit more diplomatic in a sense, not so missionary orientated. And he chose a man who seemed to have more high church tendencies, or Anglo-Catholic. His name was Bishop Blythe, William Hoppen Blythe, who arrived here in end of 1887. Now, of course, initially, this was his place, but the place belongs to CMJ. Now, he wasn't a CMJ employee like two of the previous bishops, and he wasn't a CMS employee like one other bishop. Okay, he didn't belong to either of the more evangelical societies, or he didn't align himself with either CMJ or CMS so much. And he wanted to take over Christchurch and turn it into the Anglican cathedral and put all the paraphernalia associated with the cathedral. And CMJ said, no, thank you very much. Our ministry here is to share the message of Jesus with the Jewish people. And so he turned around and said, okay, I will go and establish my own organisation. And he did, called the Jerusalem and East Mission Society, raised money in England, purchased land in East Jerusalem now, and built St. George's Cathedral, which was also opened in 1898. So 1898, therefore, was in a sense a very interesting year, the end of the year, when you see those two new churches, one representing the new German awareness, you might say, and St. George's almost representing the new Anglican awareness, because thereafter, being the seat of the bishop, most Anglicans, and perhaps even just most British people themselves, when they would be looking to get a lead from Jerusalem, would look to the bishop, because he's the representative head. So you can virtually say that from that point, CMJ began to, in a sense, lose its profile. That's probably the best way to put it. Whereas St. George's, being the seat of the bishop, just its profile began to rise further and further. And so then we get up to the First World War. And in the period prior to the First World War, you had some interesting geopolitical dynamics happening. For instance, throughout the 1800s, Britain, France and Russia were always against each other. Okay? Or if they were with each other, it was against the other one. And most occasions they were with the Turks against each other. Lots of different alliances, okay? The fact is that those three didn't like each other. But of course, when the first decade of the 20th century came along, you had Germany now rising up as a great superpower in Central Europe, and aligning itself more and more with Austro-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, that's a huge block in Central Europe. And you can already see that the Germans and the Turks were beginning to actually have more and more contact with each other in those particular years. So by the eve of the First World War, 1914, you actually had Britain, France and Russia coming together into an alliance, and you had Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire also in alliance. So the big question then was, which of those two alliances would the Turks join? And they ultimately chose to join with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So when that happened, it meant that Britain's policy of over 100 years, formulated after Napoleon's invasion here, which was to, in a sense, as much as possible, beef up Turkey to keep it strong so the other powers wouldn't come in. Now that policy was overturned because now Turkey was actually allied with the enemy, with the other side. So it meant that now Turkey and Britain were at war with each other. And I could talk for 2 or 3 hours on that period of time, because that's one of my favourite subjects, but I won't, because I've got to wrap up now. But in brief, you can basically see that many of the things that have been happening in the previous 115 or so years, since the time of Napoleon's invasion of the region in 1798, which was the first incursion of European powers here, many of those things that happened that in between time converged. You had an interest in the restoration of the Jewish people emanating from European powers, okay, for their own geopolitical purposes. You see that happening several times during that period of time. You see initially a small but then a growing interest amongst Jewish people themselves in coming back to the land. And these weren't religious Jews who were interested in this. These were nationalist, secular Jewish people who were looking for a solution for their survival in the future, because of the rise of nationalism and even anti-Semitism slowly in Europe. They realized it just wasn't a place for them. They were phantom people. They were people without a nation. They needed a place. So they began to see more and more that the land of Israel, Palestine, was the land. And then geopolitically, you have, through that entire period of time, these alliances going on. There's a lot of jockeying to make sure, for instance, as far as Britain was concerned, that no other rival European power would be lodged around the Suez Canal. Now we get into the First World War. I won't go into all the dynamics, but Britain could actually finish that war in a negative situation, whereby rival European powers, Germany or even France, even though she was allied in 1914, she could later be an enemy, that either Germany or France could actually be based on the east side of the Suez Canal if Turkey fell. Now that just wasn't good for Britain. So then Britain had to find a solution so that at the end of the war she wouldn't find herself facing a potential enemy on the other side of the Suez Canal. Okay? And so that's why you get into all these things of the Gallipoli campaign, the Sinai campaign, the establishment of the Anzac Mounted Division, the Australian and New Zealand Horsemen, Allenby coming in, the Battle of Beersheba in 1917, all those things are part of that whole story. And of course, you had two things going on here at the same time. I mean, amidst all that activity, you had military activities happening, whereby with the conquest of the land, but also you had political things happening at the same time, because Britain had to be sure that at the end of the military campaign, if Britain and the Aussies and the Kiwis conquered the land, then Britain had to be sure that the fruits of that victory wouldn't be taken over by her allies, the French, for instance, or somebody else. So therefore Britain had to work on a policy which would actually safeguard her own interests. But Britain knew politically that the French would never agree to them having sole control, and the Russians, while they were still involved, would never agree to that. And the Americans, who they were trying to get involved, would never agree to that. The Vatican and the Italians, who were also allies, surely would never agree to a Protestant power having sole control over the Holy Country, the Holy Land. So Britain had to find a solution that was going to fulfill her own interests, yet at the same time not overtly upset her allies, and that was the Jewish people, the Zionist organization, who by this stage were strong enough that they could actually step forward and say, here's a proposal. When the land is conquered, would you please think favourably towards having a Jewish national home? And that's the background of the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration, I've read and heard things over the years. It was all to do with Chaim Weizmann inventing acetone and so on and so forth. That is a small part of the bigger picture, because there were lots of things happening behind the scenes in different areas, but a lot of activities happening behind the scenes well before and beside that little incident of Weizmann inventing acetone. That was basically a story that Lloyd George himself wrote in his own autobiography many years later. And so therefore you have in 1917, on the 31st of October, two things happening. Militarily, the Australians, New Zealanders and the British captured Beersheba, which was the first victory in the campaign, and politically the cabinet meeting in London and formulating what became known as the Balfour Declaration. Okay? And so that basically is, in a sense, that sums it up. Alame's entrance into Jerusalem just 5 weeks later was, an extra layer of cream on top. And even that's very interesting. When Allenby came in, he came firstly to our other, CMJ's other property in Jerusalem, which is where the International School is now located. That was then our hospital. And it seems, from the evidence we can gather, that that's where he probably got his horse from. He drove up to there, got his horse, came down here to the ceremony just outside here. And the closest buildings to him basically were those of Christchurch. He faced Christchurch. All the official photographs were taken from our roofs here. And from a parochial perspective, a big part of that Guard of Honour opposite Allenby were from Australia and New Zealand. And they parked the horses just around the other side of the museum that, as you know, in time I was able to establish there. You can see it on the photograph. And after that ceremony took place, Allenby went back to the Anglican school for a lunch. It wasn't called the Anglican school then, of course. It was just the mission hospital. And seemingly had a lunch in the headquarters, or the doctor's house, which was also the headquarters of the 60th Division. And it was at that function that Lawrence of Arabia came, and the French High Commissioner designate, who made possibly the last chance the French ever had for getting control here. And Allenby basically said, "Not now. This is not for you to take over," etc., etc. There's a whole story there. We did a documentary about that recently called "The Destiny of Britain." A lot of stories in there. Behind it all, and I do have a bias. Everybody has a bias, and my bias is that I believe that God is sovereign, and I believe that He does work through the affairs of man, and He uses us. Why He uses us is one of those great mysteries. We'll ask Him all one day, but He does use us. He uses institutions, He uses nations. Put it this way, He works through institutions and He works through nations. And many times those institutions and nations seem to have their own agenda. And that agenda often, you would think on paper, is opposite to what would be part of God's nature. Yet, at the end of it, when you look back, you can see that despite what they want to do, somehow or other God's purposes are still being worked out in it and through it. And that's one of the closest examples I've personally seen of the concept of the sovereignty of God.